So I want you all to know that I don't want to give this talk. That doesn't make any sense, does it? After all, I'm a preacher. I'm used to speaking in front of people, and I actually did apply to speak at Leeds, so why wouldn't I want to give this talk? I don't want to give this talk because in preparing to do so, I've been invited to revisit some very difficult experiences in my first years of vocational ministry. My first pastorate turned out to be nothing like I expected. As the oldest of 3 kids, I always wondered why God gave my brothers special gifts, areas where they excelled, but I just didn't seem to have any. My brother Jeff was witty and wicked smart, and he was excellent at tennis. My brother Jeremy is thoughtful, a good writer, and kind-hearted. Me? Well, the only thing I could ever come up with was, I think I'm a good friend. But what a silly quality to have. That's not a real thing. After floundering in undergrad because I spent way too much time honing my social skills, I went into the world of retail management, and I loved it. I loved the clothes, I loved managing people, I loved the business, and I loved our clients. Once my children came into the picture, I hung it up for good, and I began to work in a small business doing some in-house accounting for them. It was the perfect job. I loved what I did. I loved my coworkers. I loved my hours. I thought I was living the dream. I had time to work. I had time to raise my kids. I had time to be involved in church in all the ways that I wanted to be involved. But that all changed the year I turned 40. It was then that I heard my call to vocational ministry, and my response to God was, absolutely not. You've lost your mind. And then finally, I just flat out said no. Well, let's just say God won that argument. And it was in seminary that I began to understand that what I saw as a silly strength would actually be an asset in ministry. Because you know what? You can preach your heart out. You can be the best organizer and strategizer in the world. You can exegete a text with brilliance. But if you don't have any relational skills, you're not going to be effective in ministry. My theology tells me that everything about God is relationship. God's Trinitarian nature, God's creation of humanity and all of creation, our relationship with God, with one another, and with the greater creation. Nothing, not one single thing exists without some sort of relationship to another. So I'm wondering, why isn't more time spent in seminaries preparing future ministry leaders how to recognize and navigate emotional systems that are present in all ministry settings? Really, in all of life. I entered into my first church as an associate pastor. I was bright-eyed and excited for ministry. I had done well in seminary. I loved stretching my mind. I had made some really strong connections, and I couldn't wait to implement what I had been learning into my practice of ministry. And I was confident that my strong relational skills would serve me well. My confidence was soon shaken when I found myself smack in the middle of a very strong emotional system in my church on day 3 of the job. And I remember thinking to myself, what is happening? I understood how the business world worked, and though I'm a Cradle United Methodist and have always been active in church, I didn't understand the seemingly alternate universe that we call ministry. Quite possibly for the first time in my life, I didn't know what to do. Actions and conversations that I was having were misconstrued by some. What seemed to me to be logical and rational business decisions were questioned and resisted. I was confused, and as time wore on, I began to second-guess the one thing I had always had confidence in: my relational skills. I had one class in seminary that touched on family systems theory. It was in my field education class where we read Edwin Freeman's book, Failure of Nerve. And as a student, this book was transformative for me. After reading it, my curiosity grew. The theory behind it made sense, but what did it mean to be an actual non-anxious leader? Is it possible when the people with whom you are in ministry are highly anxious? The book was more relevant than ever in my first church. From the book, I recalled that my mere presence in the system of the church was a disturbance, and I knew that it was going to take time for the system to adjust to my being in them. It's easy enough to read and understand on an intellectual level, but it is extremely difficult to actually live through. Over time, as I unknowingly stepped into some landmines, I discovered that this congregation had many very deep, complex relational systems present. Anything new or anyone new seemed to be rejected and expelled, at times, even me. The congregation was so chronically anxious that even the slightest change flared symptoms to the extreme. It was difficult. It was painful, and over time I became more and more frustrated. I began to see myself as a victim in the midst of this system I didn't think I had any control over. I don't want to give this talk. Because in the telling of my story, I don't want anyone to hear that though I had some difficult experiences in my first appointment, I am somehow judging the emotional systems of this particular congregation. I don't want to give this talk because in doing so, I have committed myself to speaking the truth. And speaking the truth is hard, and it leaves me feeling very vulnerable. My mom loves to tell the story of going to my second grade parent-teacher conference. If she were here, she would tell you that Mrs. Greenlee told her something that my mom already knew to be true about me when she said, "Jennifer can be painfully honest." I'm someone who holds honesty in high regard. I appreciate others who speak the truth, and I hold myself accountable to do the same. It is this drive, along with no longer wanting to see myself as victim, that I approached the senior pastor to challenge the system I found so difficult to work within. I felt it was important to talk about this anxious system present in this church and the ways that it caused the church to lose sight of its mission and focus. And though this senior pastor and I had an excellent working relationship, I still found myself concerned about naming what I was experiencing. Would I be seen as and labeled a whiner, a complainer, someone who couldn't hack ministry? And then when I asked to speak with the staff parish relations committee, would my concerns be met with skepticism from them? Fortunately, my fears were not a reality. In fact, quite the opposite was true. There is something so powerful about naming unspoken things out loud. What I hadn't fully thought through, though, was that just naming something is not enough. And as hard as that was for me to do, I realized that God didn't want me to stop there. It was going to be a part of my job to help the church reduce its chronic anxiety so that they could be more sensitive to the Spirit in their midst. And I had no idea that this meant I was going to have to take my own journey of self-examination. Anyone who has studied family systems theory knows that at the heart of the theory is an awareness of how you function within your own family of origin system. And as your eyes are opened up to your reactivity within your own family, a clearer picture of the ways that you respond in emotional systems outside of your family come to the surface. It is through this process of awareness, along with a willingness to adjust some of your reactions, that maturity begins to happen and a less anxious leader grows. I actually did want to give this talk. I wanted to give it because so much of what we as ministry leaders here celebrated are the things that are new or innovative or are easily measurable. And I am so very glad that we do this. It gives us energy for our ministry, and it reminds us that God is present in the innovation and in the work that we do. I wanted to give this talk because I've never heard the foundational parts of ministry celebrated. Let's be honest, it's not glamorous work. It's hard to celebrate the parts that aren't easily quantified or measurable. Though the push seems to be towards the new and innovative, I took the plunge over the past several years and have invested deeply into understanding family systems theory. It has been in this quest to genuinely lean into the direction I believe God is calling me to that I realized I was going to have to confront my own baggage. It is then that the hard work of healing for both me and the church began. Self-examination is very challenging. Places in our hearts where we hurt the most. And as I learned more about emotional systems, I discovered I was going to have to examine my own family of origin. It was and is in those places where the pain cuts closest to my heart. For the past 2 years, I've been involved in a leadership training series called Healthy Congregations. It's a series which focuses on leadership growth through an examination of family systems theory. Through this series, I am learning to take a thoughtful look at my family and examine the ways that I react and interact with each person in my family. It's been an eye-opening process for me. Each month, we present our family diagram and get some coaching from our peers, as well as a qualified coach. Having others look into my family without the emotional ties that I have has been enlightening, challenging, and growth-producing for me. And it was in my first coaching session that I began to see that I've been doing the work of challenging systems long before I ended up in my first church. During the coaching session, I shared that I was a second career pastor. I also shared the challenges my family faced as I changed the course of our lives and entered into seminary. My peer group and my coach pointed out that I didn't give up, even when my family system was clearly in a state of discomfort and wanted things to go back to the way that they were. They called me courageous, and I cried. I wanted to do this talk because I have a deep yearning to hear others talk about the realness of ministry. It's hard, it's beautiful, it's complicated. It is so many paradoxes rolled up into the sacred and the holy. It's a privilege and it is a gift. It's a gift and it is hard. As I grow, I'm learning how to be more compassionate with myself. And in turn, I'm learning how to be more compassionate with others. As I mature, I'm becoming a more thoughtful, less reactive, sensitive pastor and person. My first pastorate turned out to be nothing like I expected. Instead of an idealistic community and experience, I got very real humans in a very real community. Instead of gentle lessons on how to grow in leadership and how to learn how to be a pastor, I got profound lessons on what it means to do the work of Christ in the midst of tension and brokenness. Instead of being welcomed with open arms by this community, I learned what it means to have strength and perseverance and determination to lead and to love wherever it is that God sends me. I wanted to do this talk. I wanted to do this talk because I want others to know about this community that was a part of shaping me into who I am becoming. I wanted to do this talk because in all the complexities, the difficulties, and the challenges, I got to love a community of people. We laughed and cried together. We struggled and celebrated together. We worshiped and we grew together. I wanted to do this talk because I got to love very deeply a very complicated community. And in return, I was deeply loved by the people and by God. I wanted to do this talk because it is in this foundational work of self-examination and understanding how emotional systems function that healing begins to blossom in ourselves and our communities. Thank you.